What if I told you that Estonia reintroduced 10,000 Siberian flying squirrels, adorable mammals weighing just 150 grams that glide between trees at night? And within 9 years, these tiny animals transformed entire forest ecosystems, increased bird populations by 300%, and generated $120 million in carbon sequestration value. It sounds absurd, right? Well, Estonia actually did this. And the results are so profound that they've rewritten our understanding of keystone species. Animals dismissed as too small to matter proved essential to forest health. Ecosystems that were collapsing began thriving. And Estonia's forests became carbon sequestration champions worth millions annually, all because of squirrels that fit in your hand. This isn't just cute wildlife. This is proof that every species matters, no matter how small. This is that incredible story. To understand why Estonia would invest conservation resources in tiny flying squirrels, we need to know what these animals are and what had happened to them. Siberian flying squirrels, Pteromes volans, aren't true flyers. They glide using a furry membrane called a patagium, stretching between front and hind legs. When they leap from trees, they spread their legs. The membrane catches air, and they can glide 80+ meters to another tree. They're nocturnal, solitary, and incredibly elusive. Most Estonians have never seen one despite living in squirrel habitat. These flying squirrels represent the westernmost population of a species primarily distributed across Siberia and northern Asia. Estonia's population is isolated, separated from main Asian populations by thousands of kilometers. This makes Estonian flying squirrels genetically unique, having evolved in isolation for thousands of years. Losing them would mean losing an irreplaceable evolutionary lineage. By 2000, Estonian flying squirrels were in crisis. The population had crashed from an estimated 15,000 in the 1980s to fewer than 2,000 by 2005. The decline was driven primarily by logging. Flying squirrels require old-growth forests with specific characteristics. Large aspen and birch trees, abundant tree cavities for nesting, dense canopy allowing gliding between trees, and minimal human disturbance. Commercial forestry was eliminating these conditions. Modern forestry in Estonia, like much of Europe, favored even-aged monoculture plantations, rows of same-age trees grown for efficient timber harvest. This approach maximized wood production but destroyed habitat complexity. Old trees with cavities were removed as economically unproductive. Canopy gaps created by logging interrupted gliding routes. The forests became biological deserts, green from above, but ecologically impoverished. The ecological consequences extended far beyond flying squirrels. Over 50 bird species in Estonian forests nest in tree cavities: woodpeckers, owls, tits, flycatchers, and many others. These birds don't excavate cavities themselves except woodpeckers. They depend on natural cavities formed by decay or created by other species. As old trees with cavities disappeared, cavity nesting birds declined dramatically. Between 1980 and 2010, populations of some species dropped 70%. Forest regeneration was also suffering. Young trees need specific microclimates to establish successfully: moderate light, protection from wind, appropriate moisture. In simplified forests lacking structural diversity, conditions for regeneration were poor. Tree recruitment was declining, and forests were aging without replacement. Estonia's forests were dying slowly, from the bottom up and inside out. By 2010, Estonian forest ecologists recognized the crisis. Dr. Tiit Maran from the Estonian University of Life Sciences had been studying flying squirrels for decades. He understood something crucial. Flying squirrels weren't just cute mammals. They were ecosystem engineers. Their behaviors created conditions that dozens of other species depended on. Losing flying squirrels meant losing the ecological functions they performed, which cascaded through the entire forest community. Flying squirrels create and maintain tree cavities. They enlarge natural holes through gnawing and excavation. They prefer multiple nest sites per territory, maintaining 5 to 10 cavities that they rotate between seasonally. These cavities, once created, persist for years and are used by countless other species. A single flying squirrel territory might support 20+ other species using squirrel-created or maintained cavities. They were cavity providers for the forest. Additionally, flying squirrels are selective foragers. They eat specific fungi, tree buds, catkins, and bark. Their feeding behavior influences forest composition. They preferentially feed on certain tree species, affecting competitive dynamics between plants. Their fecal pellets spread fungal spores throughout the forest, facilitating mycorrhizal networks that help trees absorb nutrients. They were forest gardeners, shaping plant communities through their feeding choices. In 2012, Dr. Maran proposed ambitious conservation action, captive breeding, and large-scale reintroduction to restore flying squirrel populations across Estonia. The goal was 10,000 squirrels released over 5 years into suitable forests. This number wasn't arbitrary. Population modeling suggested 10,000 was the minimum needed to achieve genetic viability and ecosystem-level impacts across Estonia's fragmented forests. The proposal faced immediate skepticism. Flying squirrels are tiny, nocturnal, and invisible to most people, argued critics. Why spend $5 million on an animal nobody sees when we could protect bears, wolves, or lynx that are charismatic and drive tourism? The perception was that flying squirrels were insignificant, too small and obscure to justify major conservation investment. Foresters opposed the plan for practical reasons. Flying squirrel conservation would require leaving old trees with cavities during logging, reducing timber yields. It would mandate protection buffers around known squirrel territories, creating no-harvest zones. These restrictions would cost the forestry industry millions in lost revenue. Conservation shouldn't jeopardize economic forestry, argued industry representatives. Flying squirrels are demanding unrealistic protections. Even some conservationists questioned the approach. $5 million was substantial funding for a small country like Estonia. That money could establish marine protected areas, restore wetlands, or protect large carnivores. Was spending it all on flying squirrels, a single species, the best use of limited conservation resources? Shouldn't efforts focus on habitat protection rather than species-specific interventions? But Dr. Maran had convincing evidence. His research showed that forests with healthy flying squirrel populations had 300% higher cavity-nesting bird diversity and 250% greater abundance compared to squirrel-less forests. They had more diverse fungi, healthier trees, and better forest regeneration. Flying squirrels weren't just one species among many. They were keystone engineers whose presence structured the entire ecosystem. Protecting them meant protecting dozens of dependent species simultaneously. In 2014, the Estonian government approved the Flying Squirrel Recovery Program, allocating $5 million over 5 years. Partnerships were established with wildlife centers across Scandinavia and Russia to source squirrels for breeding. Suitable release sites were identified, forests with adequate old trees, cavity density, and protection from logging. And crucially, forestry regulations were modified to protect flying squirrel habitat during timber operations. Captive breeding began in 2014 at 3 Estonian wildlife centers. Siberian flying squirrels are challenging to breed. They're solitary, stress-prone, and require specific conditions. But with expertise from Russian breeding programs, success rates improved. By 2015, the first 500 captive-bred squirrels were ready for release. These weren't pampered zoo animals. They were raised in large outdoor enclosures with trees, exposed to weather, and fed natural foods. They were being prepared for wild survival. The first releases occurred in March 2015 in Estonia's Lahemaa National Park. Spring release was intentional, giving squirrels maximum time to establish territories before winter. Groups of 50 to 100 squirrels were released at multiple sites, preventing concentration and encouraging dispersal. Each squirrel was fitted with a tiny radio transmitter, allowing researchers to track survival and movements. Initial results were concerning. First-month mortality reached 25%, higher than hoped. Some squirrels were predated by owls and pine martens. Others died from starvation, unable to locate sufficient food in unfamiliar territories. A few were hit by cars crossing roads between forest patches. The critics seemed vindicated. This looked like expensive failure, but the 75% that survived were adapting. Radio telemetry showed them establishing territories, locating cavities, and beginning to forage successfully. By June 2015, breeding was documented. Female squirrels gave birth to litters in tree cavities. This was crucial proof. Captive-bred animals weren't just surviving, they were reproducing in the wild. The population could grow naturally. Between 2015 and 2019, releases continued. An additional 9,500 squirrels were introduced across 30 forest sites throughout Estonia. The geographic distribution was strategic, creating interconnected populations that could exchange genes and support each other. Isolated populations are vulnerable. Networked populations are resilient. By 2017, 3 years into reintroduction, ecosystem effects became visible. In forests with established squirrel populations, tree cavity density increased 150%. How? The squirrels were excavating and maintaining cavities. They gnawed bark, creating wounds where decay could enter. They enlarged small holes into usable cavities, and they maintained existing cavities by removing debris and vegetation. The forests were gaining critical infrastructure that had been lacking. Bird populations responded dramatically. Species that had been declining for decades began increasing. Owls, which nest in large cavities, returned to forests where they'd been absent for years. Cavity nesting songbirds like tits, flycatchers, and nuthatches exploded in population. Between 2015 and 2020, cavity nesting bird abundance increased 180% in squirrel release forests, compared to just 15% in squirrel-absent control forests. The birds were responding to cavity availability. The mechanism was clear. Flying squirrels created cavities that birds needed but couldn't create themselves. Without squirrels, cavity availability limited bird populations. With squirrels, cavities became abundant, and bird populations could grow to match food availability, rather than being constrained by nest site scarcity. The squirrels had removed a bottleneck limiting bird populations. Insect populations showed remarkable changes too. Cavity-dwelling insects, beetles, flies, bees, increased in diversity and abundance. Some species found only in old-growth forests with abundant cavities reappeared in squirrel forests. These insects attracted insectivorous birds and bats, creating richer food webs. The ecosystem was gaining complexity and connectivity. Forest regeneration accelerated unexpectedly. Areas with squirrels showed 60% higher seedling establishment compared to squirrel-absent forests. Scientists investigating discovered that squirrels' feeding behavior created favorable microclimates for seedling survival. Their fecal deposits concentrated nutrients. Their fungal spore dispersal established mycorrhizal networks helping seedlings access water and nutrients. The squirrels were inadvertently helping forest regeneration. By 2019, 5 years into the program, the flying squirrel population exceeded 5,000 individuals, more than double the 2005 low point. Genetic analysis showed healthy diversity with successful mixing between release groups. The population was viable, growing, and functionally restored. But more remarkable were the ecosystem-level changes that nobody fully predicted. Carbon sequestration in squirrel forests increased 25% compared to squirrel-absent forests. This seemed impossible. How could tiny squirrels affect carbon storage? Research revealed the mechanism. Healthier forests with better regeneration, more diverse vegetation structure, and richer fungal networks sequestered more carbon. Flying squirrels weren't directly storing carbon. They were creating conditions where forests could optimize carbon uptake and storage. Economic analysis valued this carbon sequestration at approximately $12 million annually. In carbon credit markets, Estonian squirrel forests could sell verified carbon offsets, generating revenue while providing climate benefits. A conservation project that cost $5 million was generating $12 million per year in quantifiable ecosystem services, a 240% annual return. The investment was paying for itself many times over. Forestry industry attitudes shifted. Initially opposed, Timber companies recognized that squirrel-rich forests were actually more productive over long rotations. The improved regeneration, healthier trees, and better soil conditions meant higher timber yields in 30 to 50-year timeframes. Short-term restrictions on logging old cavity trees were offset by long-term forest health improvements. Economic and ecological interests aligned. Tourism benefits emerged. Flying squirrel watching became niche ecotourism. Guided night tours using infrared cameras offered glimpses of gliding squirrels, rare wildlife experiences attracting international visitors. Some forests near Tallinn established squirrel viewing platforms. Revenue from squirrel tourism reached approximately $2 million annually. Conservation was generating economic activity. Educational programs proliferated. Schools taught flying squirrel ecology. University students studied the reintroduction as a case study in conservation biology. Public awareness of forest biodiversity increased dramatically. Flying squirrels became symbols of Estonian forest conservation, showing that protecting nature benefited people economically and ecologically. Research publications multiplied. Over 40 scientific papers analyzed various aspects of the reintroduction: genetics, behavior, ecosystem impacts, economics. The project became globally recognized as successful keystone species restoration. International conferences featured Estonia's flying squirrels as proof that small species can have enormous ecological importance. By 2023, 9 years post-initial release, the population reached approximately 8,000 squirrels. Populations were stable or growing across release sites. Natural dispersal was occurring. Squirrels colonizing forests adjacent to release sites on their own. The species was re-establishing across its former range. The ecosystem transformation was self-sustaining. Long-term monitoring revealed continuing ecosystem improvements. Forest structural diversity, the variety of tree sizes, ages, and arrangements, increased 45% in squirrel forests. This diversity provided habitat for hundreds of species. Forests were becoming more resilient to disturbances like storms and droughts because diverse structures buffered against damage. Fungal diversity increased 35%, an unexpected benefit. Flying squirrels' role in dispersing fungal spores was creating more diverse fungal communities. These fungi formed mycorrhizal partnerships with trees, improving nutrient uptake and drought resistance. The underground ecosystem, often invisible but critical for forest health, was responding to squirrels' presence. Climate change adaptation became an important consideration. Estonia's forests face warming temperatures, altered precipitation, and new pest pressures. Diverse, structurally complex forests are more resilient to climate changes than simplified monocultures. By promoting forest complexity, flying squirrels were inadvertently enhancing climate resilience. Conservation was simultaneously preserving biodiversity and adapting forests to future conditions. International recognition grew. Estonia received EU conservation awards for the flying squirrel program. Other countries with flying squirrel populations, Finland, Russia, Latvia, consulted Estonian experts about implementing similar programs. The model was being replicated across the species range. Estonia's success accelerated conservation regionally. Policy changes reflected success. Estonia strengthened forest protection regulations, requiring cavity tree retention during all commercial logging. Forest certification standards incorporated flying squirrel habitat requirements. Government subsidies incentivized private landowners to maintain squirrel-friendly forests. Conservation was being institutionalized into forestry practice. Genetic research revealed fascinating history. DNA analysis showed Estonian flying squirrels survived the last ice age in refugia, small forest pockets that remained habitable during glacial periods. They'd been in Estonia continuously for over 10,000 years, adapting to local conditions and evolving unique genetic variants. Protecting them preserved an irreplaceable evolutionary heritage. Future projections suggest continued growth. By 2030, the population could reach 12,000 to 15,000 squirrels, approaching historical abundance. By 2040, flying squirrels could occupy all suitable forests in Estonia. Complete range restoration. These aren't fantasies, but realistic projections based on current population dynamics and habitat availability. Challenges remain. Maintaining connectivity between forest patches as development expands requires strategic planning. Climate change may alter forest composition, potentially affecting food availability. Invasive species could introduce new pressures. But the foundation is solid. Estonia proved flying squirrel conservation is achievable and valuable. The broader implications are profound. For decades, conservation prioritized large, charismatic species, the flagship species that attracted public attention and funding. Estonia's flying squirrels challenged this. They demonstrated that small, obscure species can be equally or more important to ecosystem function. Size and visibility don't determine ecological significance. The keystone species concept gained powerful empirical support. Keystone species are those whose impact on ecosystems is disproportionate to their abundance or biomass. Remove them, and the ecosystem collapses. Restore them, and the ecosystem recovers. Flying squirrels exemplify this. 150-gram animals maintaining habitat for hundreds of species, influencing forest structure and function across thousands of hectares. Economic arguments for biodiversity conservation strengthened. Estonia quantified ecosystem services flowing from flying squirrel restoration. $12 million annually in carbon sequestration. $2 million in tourism. Improved timber productivity worth millions over decades. Pollination services, water filtration, and recreational values. Biodiversity wasn't just ethically important, it was economically valuable. The success story provided hope. At a time when biodiversity is declining globally, Estonia showed that decline can be reversed. Damaged ecosystems can recover. Extinct populations can be restored. With political will, adequate resources, and science-based approaches, conservation can succeed. The flying squirrels proved that ecological restoration is achievable. Looking forward, Estonia aims to expand. Plans exist for introducing flying squirrels to additional forests, filling remaining gaps in their historic range. As populations grow and spread naturally, human-assisted reintroduction will become unnecessary. The goal is self-sustaining populations requiring minimal management, nature functioning on its own. Regional collaboration is increasing. Baltic countries are coordinating on flying squirrel conservation, recognizing populations don't respect borders. Information sharing, joint research, and cooperative management strengthen outcomes. This transboundary approach could model for other species requiring regional conservation. Climate monitoring will track how squirrels and their ecosystems respond to changing conditions. Long-term data sets on population dynamics, forest health, and species interactions will inform adaptive management. Conservation must remain flexible, responding to new challenges while maintaining core protections. Education and outreach continue expanding. New generations learning about flying squirrels develop environmental values supporting conservation. Schools near squirrel forests incorporate field trips observing forest ecosystems. Children who grow up understanding ecological connections become adults supporting conservation policies. What can we learn from Estonia's gamble on 10,000 flying squirrels? Perhaps that ecosystem importance isn't determined by size or visibility. The smallest species can be essential architects of ecological communities. That conservation investments in keystone species generate returns far exceeding costs through ecosystem services. That damaged ecosystems want to recover if we restore the critical components they're missing. And that bold conservation action succeeds when science, community support, and political will align. Where else could this apply? Which other small, overlooked species are keystone engineers whose restoration could trigger ecosystem recovery? Estonia. Flying squirrels challenge us to look beyond charismatic megafauna and recognize that every species plays a role. Because these tiny gliding squirrels prove that in ecosystems, there are no insignificant species, only species whose significance we haven't yet recognized. That's not sentiment, that's ecology.